Next two chapters of Chronicles of Narnia. So, little recap. The first chapter, Diggory and Polly met. Whatever. Second chapter, they went into Diggory's Uncle Andrew, into his like secret attic study, and they weren't supposed to be in there. And they tried to get out of it. Polly kind of got tricked into grabbing a magic ring and disappeared. Just poof, no noise, no theatrics, just poof, she's gone. And so Diggory had to go and get her because his uncle wouldn't do it, pretty much. His uncle was pretty much like, I'm too old for that, you go get her. And now we are on chapter 3, The Wood Between Worlds. This is a picture. All right, here we go. Uncle Andrew and his study vanished instantly. Then, for a moment, everything became muddled. The next thing Diggory knew was that there was a soft green light coming down on him from above and darkness below. He didn't seem to be standing on anything or sitting or lying. Nothing appeared to be touching him. I believe I'm in water, said Diggory, or under water. This frightened him for a second, but almost at once he could feel that he was rushing upwards. Then his head suddenly came out into the air and he found himself scrambling ashore, out onto smooth, grassy ground at the edge of a pool. As he rose to his feet, he noticed that he was neither dripping nor panting for breath, as anyone would expect from being underwater. His clothes were perfectly dry. He was standing by the edge of a small pool, not more than 10 feet from side to side in a wood. The trees grew close together and were so leafy that he could get no glimpse of the sky. All the light was green light that came through the leaves, but there must have been a very strong sun overhead, for the green daylight was bright and warm. It was the quietest wood you could possibly imagine. There were no birds, no insects, no animals, and no wind. You could almost feel the trees growing. The pool he had just got out of was not the only pool. There were dozens of others, a pool every few yards as far as his eyes could reach. You could almost feel the trees drinking the water up from their roots. This wood was very much alive. When he tried to describe it afterwards, Diggory always said it was a rich place, as rich as plum cake. The strangest thing was that almost before he had looked about him, Diggory had half forgotten how he had come here. At any rate, he was certainly not thinking about Polly or Uncle Andrew or even his mother. He was not in the least frightened or excited or nervous. If anyone had asked him, "Where did you come from?" he would probably have said, I've always been here. That was what it felt like, as if one had always been in that place and never been bored, although nothing had ever happened. As he said long afterwards, it's not the sort of place where things happen. The trees go on growing, that's all. After Diggory had looked at the wood for a long time, he noticed that there was a girl lying on her back at the foot of a tree a few yards away. Her eyes were nearly shut, but not quite, as if she were just between sleeping and waking. So he looked at her for a long time and said nothing. And at last she opened her eyes and looked at him for a long time. And she also said nothing. Then she spoke, in a dreamy, contented sort of voice. "I think I've seen you before," she said. "I rather think so too," said Diggory. "Have you been here long?" "Oh, always," said the girl. "At least, I don't know, a very long time." "So have I," said Diggory. "No, you haven't," said she. "I've just seen you come up from that pool." "Yes, I suppose I did," said Diggory with a puzzled air. "I'd forgotten." Then, for quite a long time, neither said any more. "Look here," said the girl presently. "I wonder, did we ever really meet before? I had a sort of idea, a sort of picture in my head, of a boy and a girl like us, living somewhere quite different, and doing all sorts of things. Perhaps it was only a dream." "I've had that same dream, I think," said Diggory, "about a boy and a girl living next door, and something about crawling among rafters. I remember the girl had a dirty face." "Are you getting it mixed? In my dream, it was the boy who had the dirty face." "I can't remember the boy's face," said Diggory, and then added, "Hello." What's that? Why, it's a guinea pig, said the girl, and it was. A fat guinea pig nosing among it. Sorry, tongue-tied. I can't remember the boy's face, said Diggory, and then added, hello, what's that? Why, it's a guinea pig, said the girl, and it was. A fat guinea pig nosing about in the grass, but round in the middle. In the middle of the guinea pig there ran a tape, and tied to it by the tape was a bright yellow ring. Look, look, cried Diggory, the ring, and look, you've got one on your finger, and so have I. The girl now sat up, really interested at last. They stared very hard at one another, trying to remember. And then, at exactly the same moment, she shouted, Mr. Ketterly! And he shouted, Uncle Andrew. And they knew who they were and began to remember the whole story. After a few minutes hard talking, they had got it straight. Diggory explained how beastly Uncle Andrew had been. What do we do now? Said Polly. Take the guinea pig and go home? There's no hurry, said Diggory with a huge yawn. I think there is, said Polly. This place is too quiet, so dreamy. You're almost asleep. If we once give in to it, we shall just lie down and drowse forever and ever. It's very nice here, said Diggory. Yes, it is, said Polly. But we've got to get back. She stood up and began to go cautiously towards the guinea pig, but then she changed her mind. Might as well leave the guinea pig, she said. It's perfectly happy here, and your uncle will only do something horrid to it if we take it home. I bet he would, answered Diggory. Look at how he's treated us. By the way, how do we get home? Go back into the pool, I expect. They came and stood together at the edge, looking down into the smooth water. It was full of the reflection of the green leafy branches. They made it look very deep. We haven't any bathing things, said Polly. We shan't need them, silly, said Diggory. We're going in with our clothes on. Don't you remember? It didn't wet us on the way up. Can you swim? A bit, can you? Well, not much. I don't think we shall need to swim, said Diggory. If we want to go down, don't we? Said Diggory. We want to go down, don't we? Neither of them much liked the idea of jumping into that pool, but neither said so to the other. They took hands and said, 1, 2, 3, go, and jumped. There was a great splash, and of course they closed their eyes. When they opened them again, they found they were still standing, hand in hand, in the green wood, and hardly up to their ankles in water. The pool was apparently only a couple of inches deep. They splashed back onto dry ground. What on earth's gone wrong? Said Polly in a frightened voice, but not quite so frightened as you might expect, because it was very hard to really feel frightened in that wood. The place is too peaceful. Oh, I know, said Diggory. Of course it won't work. We're still wearing our yellow rings. They're for the outward journey, you know. The green ones take you home. We must change rings. Have you got pockets? Good. Put your yellow ring in your left pocket. I've got 2 greens. Here's one for you. They put on their green rings and came back to the pool. But before they tried another jump, Diggory gave a long, oh! What's the matter? Said Polly. I've just had a really wonderful idea, said Diggory. What are all the other pools? How do you mean? Why, if we can get back to our own world by jumping into this pool, mustn't we get somewhere else by jumping into one of the others? Supposing there was a world at the bottom of every pool. But I thought we were already in your Uncle Andrew's other world or other place or whatever he called it. Didn't you say? Oh, bother Uncle Andrew, interrupted Diggory. I don't believe he knows anything about it. He never had the pluck to come here himself. He only talked of one other world. But suppose there were dozens. You mean this wood might be only one of them? No, I don't believe this wood is a world at all. I think it's just a sort of in-between place. Polly looked puzzled. Don't you see? Said Diggory. No, do listen. Think of our tunnel under the slats at home. It isn't a room in any of the houses in a way. It isn't really part of any of the houses, but once you're in the tunnel, you can go along it and come into any of the houses in the row. Mightn't this wood be the same? A place that isn't in any of the worlds, but once you've found that place, you can get into them all. Well, even if you can, began Polly, But Diggory went on as if he hadn't heard her. "And of course that explains everything," he said. "That's why it's so quiet and sleeping here. Nothing ever happens here, like at home. It's in the houses that people talk and do things and have meals. Nothing goes on in the in-between places, behind the walls and above the ceilings and under the floor or in our own tunnel. But when you come out of our tunnel, you may find yourself in any house. I think we can get out of this place into jolly well anywhere. We don't need to jump back into the same pool we came up, or not just yet." "The wood between the worlds," said Polly dreamily. "It sounds rather nice." If the camera moves, it's because Buster's kicking my makeshift stand. Sorry. Open this water. "Come on," said Diggory. "Which pool shall we try?" "Look here," said Polly. "I'm not going to try any new pool till we've made sure we can get back by the old one. We're not even sure if it'll work yet." "Yes," said Diggory, "and get caught by Uncle Andrew and have our rings taken before we have any fun. No thanks." "Couldn't we just go part of the way down into our own pool?" said Polly, "just to see if it works. Then if it does, we'll change rings and come up again before we're really back in Mr. Kettley's study." "Can we go part of the way down?" Well, it took time coming up. I suppose it'll take time going back." Diggory made rather a fuss about agreeing to this, but he had to in the end because Polly absolutely refused to do any exploring at any new worlds until she had made sure about getting back to the old one. She was quite as brave as he about some dangers, wasps for instance. But she was not so interested in finding out things nobody had ever heard of before. For Diggory was the sort of person who wants to know everything, and when he grew up, he became the famous Professor Kirk, who comes into other books. After a good deal of arguing, they agreed to put on their green rings, green for safety, said Diggory. So you can't help remembering which is which, and hold hands and jump. But as soon as they seemed to be getting back to Uncle Andrew's study, or even to their own world, Polly was to shout change, and they would slip off their greens and put on their yellows. Diggory wanted to be the one who shouted change, but Polly wouldn't agree. They put on their green rings, took hands, and once more shouted 1, 2, 3, go. This time it worked. It is very hard to tell you what it felt like, for everything happened so quickly. At first, there were bright lights moving about in a black sky. Diggory always thinks these were stars, and even swears he saw Jupiter quite close enough to see its moon. But almost at once there were rows and rows of roofs and chimneys, pots about them, and they could see St. Paul's and knew they were looking at London. But you could see through the walls of the houses. Then they could see Uncle Andrew, very vague and shadowy, but getting clearer and more solid looking all the time, just as if he were coming into focus. But before he became quite real, Polly shouted change. They did change, and our world faded away like a dream, and the green light above grew stronger and stronger, till their heads came out of the pool and they scrambled ashore. And there was the wood all about them, as green and bright and still as ever. The whole thing had taken less than a minute. "There," said Diggory. "That's all right. Now for the adventure. Any pool will do. Come on, let's try that one." "Stop," said Polly. "Aren't we going to mark this pool?" They stared at each other and turned quite white as they realized the dreadful thing that Diggory had just been going to do. For there were any number of pools in the wood, and the pools were all alike and the trees were all alike. So that if they had once left behind the pool that led to their own world without making some sort of landmark, the chances were there would have been 100 to 1 against of ever finding it again. Diggory's hand was shaking as he opened his penknife and cut along a strip of turf along the bank of the pool. The soil, which smelled nice, was a rich reddish brown and showed up well against the green. "It's a good thing one of us has some sense," said Polly. "Well, don't keep on gassing about it," said Diggory. "Come along, I want to see what's in one of the other pools." And Polly gave him a pretty sharp answer, and he said something even nastier in reply. The quarrel lasted for several minutes, but It would be dull to write it all down. Let us skip on to the moment at which they stood with beating hearts and rather scared faces on the edge of the unknown pool with their yellow rings on and held hands once more said 1, 2, 3, go. Splash. Once again, it hadn't worked. This pool too appeared to be only a puddle. Instead of reaching a new world, they only got their feet wet and splashed their legs for the second time that morning. If it was a morning, it seems to be always the same time in the wood between the worlds. Blasted botheration! Exclaimed Diggory. What's gone wrong now? We've put on our yellow rings on all right. He said yellow for the outward journey. Now the truth was that Uncle Andrew, who knew nothing about the wood between the worlds, had quite a wrong idea about the rings. The yellow ones weren't outward rings, and the green ones weren't homeward rings. At least, not in the way he thought. The stuff of which both were made of had all come from the wood. The stuff in the yellow rings had the power of drawing you into the wood. It was stuff that wanted to get back to its own place, the in-between place. But the stuff in the green rings is stuff that is trying to get out of its own place. So that a green ring would take you out of the wood into a world. Uncle Andrew, you see, was working with things he did not really understand. Most magicians are. Of course, Diggory did not realize the truth quite clearly either, or not till later. When they had talked it over, they decided to try the green rings on the new pool, just to see what happened. I'm game if you are. Ooh, sorry. Just to see what happens. I'm game if you are, said Polly, but she really said this because in her heart of hearts she now felt sure that neither kind of ring was going to work at all in the new pool, and so there was nothing worse to be afraid of than another splash. I'm not quite sure that Diggory had not the same feeling. At any rate, when they had both put their green rings and come back to the edge of the water and taken hands again, they were certainly a good deal more cheerful and less solemn than they had been the first time. 1, 2, 3, go, said Diggory, and they jumped. Chapter 4, The Bell and the Hammer. I still don't know why it's called that, but oh well. But this is the art for that chapter. Okay, so chapter 4. Depending on how long this chapter is, I might read part of another one before I call it quits, but I don't know yet. The Bell and the Hammer. There was no doubt about the magic this time. Down and down they rushed, first through darkness and then through a mass of vague and whirling shapes, which might have been almost anything. It grew lighter. Then suddenly they felt as if they were standing on something solid. A moment later, everything came into focus, and they were able to look about them. What a queer place, said Diggory. I don't like it, said Polly with something like a shudder. What they noticed first was the light. It wasn't like sunlight, and it wasn't like electric light or lamps or candles or any other light they had ever seen. It was a dull, rather red light, not at all cheerful. It was steady and did not flicker. They were standing on a flat paved surface, and buildings rose all around them. There was no roof overhead. They were in a sort of courtyard. The sky was extraordinarily dark, a blue that was almost black. When you had seen the sky, you wondered that there should be any light at all. It's very funny weather here, said Diggory. I wonder if we've arrived just in time for a thunderstorm or an eclipse. I don't like it, said Polly. Both of them, without quite knowing why, were talking in whispers, and though there was no reason why they should still go on holding hands after their jump, they didn't let go. The walls rose very high all around that courtyard. They had many great windows in them, windows without glass, through which you saw nothing but black darkness. Lower down there were great pillared arches, yawning blackly like the mouths of railway tunnels. It was rather cold. The stone of which everything was built seemed to be red, but that might only be because of the curious light. It was obviously very old. Most of the flat stones that paved the courtyard had cracks across them. None of them fitted closely together, and the sharp corners were all worn off. One of the arched doorways was half filled up with rubble. The two children kept on turning round and round to look at the different sides of the courtyard. One reason was that they were afraid of somebody, or something, looking out of the windows at them when their backs were turned. "Do you think anyone lives here?" said Diggory at last, still in a whisper. "No," said Polly. "It's all in ruins. We haven't heard a sound since we came." "Let's stand still and listen for a bit," suggested Diggory. They stood still and listened, but all they could hear was the thump-thump of their own hearts. This place was at least as quiet as the wood between the worlds, but it was a different kind of quietness. The stillness of the wood had been rich and warm. You could almost hear the trees growing and full of life. This was a dead, cold, empty silence. You couldn't imagine anything growing in it. "Let's go home," said Polly. "But we haven't seen anything yet," said Diggory. "Now we're here. We simply must have a look around. I'm sure there's nothing at all interesting here. There's not much point in finding a magic ring that lets you go into other worlds if you're afraid to look at them when you've got there." "Who's talking about being afraid?" said Polly, letting go of Diggory's hand. "I only thought you didn't seem very keen on exploring this place. I'll go anywhere you go." "We can get away the moment we want to," said Diggory. "Let's take off our green rings and put them in our right-hand pockets. All we've got to do is remember that our yellows are in our left-hand pockets. You can also keep your hand as near as your pocket as you like, but don't put it in, or you'll touch your yellow and vanish." They did this and went quietly up to one of the big arched doorways, which led into the inside of a building. And when they stood on the threshold and could look in, they saw it was not so dark inside as they had thought at first. It led into a vast shadowy hall which appeared to be empty, but on the far side there was a row of pillars and arches between them, and through those arches were streamed in some more of the same tired-looking light. They crossed the hall, walking very carefully for fear of holes in the floor or of anything lying about that they might trip over. It seemed a long walk. When they had reached the other side, they came out through the arches and found themselves in another and larger courtyard. "That doesn't look very safe," said Polly, looking at a place where the wall bulged outward and looked as if it were ready to fall over into the courtyard. In one place, a pillar was missing between two arches, and the bit that came down to where the top of the pillar ought to have been hung. There was nothing to support it. Clearly, the place had been deserted for hundreds, perhaps thousands of years. "If it's lasted till now, I suppose it'll last a bit longer," said Diggory. "But we must be very quiet. But we must be very quiet. You know, a noise sometimes brings things down, like an avalanche in the Alps." They went on out of that courtyard into another doorway, and up a great flight of steps, and through vast rooms that opened out of one another till you were dizzy with the mere size of the place. Every now and then they thought they were going to get out into the open and see what sort of country lay around the enormous palace, but each time they only got into another courtyard. They must have been magnificent places when people were still living here. In one there had once been a fountain. A great stone monster with widespread wings stood with its mouth open, and you could still see a bit of piping in the back of its mouth, out of which the water used to pour. Under it was a wide stone basin to hold the water, but it was dry as a bone. In other places there were dry sticks of some sort of climbing plant, which had wound itself round the pillars and hoped to pull some of them down. But it had died long ago, and there were no ants or spiders or any of the other living things you expect to see in a ruin, and there were dry earth showed between the broken flagstones. There was no grass or moss. It was all so dreary, and all so much the same, that even Diggory was thinking they had better put on their yellow rings and get back to the warm green living forest of the in-between place. When When they came to two huge doors of some metal that might possibly be gold, one stood a little ajar. So, of course, they went to look in. Both started back and drew a long breath, for there, at last, there was something worth seeing. For a second, they thought the room was full of people, hundreds of people, all seated and all perfectly still. Polly and Diggory, as you may guess, stood perfectly still themselves for a good long time, looking in. But presently they decided that what they were looking at could not be real people. There was not a movement nor the sound of breathing among them all. They were like the most wonderful waxworks you ever saw. This time, Polly took the lead. There was something in this room which interested her more than it interested Diggory. All the figures were wearing magnificent clothes. If you were interested in clothes at all, you could hardly help going in to see them closer. And the blaze of their colors made this room look not exactly cheerful, but at any rate rich and majestic. After all the dust and emptiness of the others, it had more windows too, and there was a good deal was a good deal lighter. I can hardly describe the clothes. The figures were all robed and had crowns on their heads. The robes were of crimson and silvery gray and deep purple and vivid green, and there were patterns and pictures of flowers and strange beasts and needlework all over them. Precious stones of astonishing size and brightness stared from their crowns and hung in chains around their necks, and peeped out from all the places where anything was fastened. "Why haven't these clothes all rotted away long ago?" asked Polly. "Magic," whispered Diggory. "Can't you feel it? I bet this whole room is just stiff with enchantments. I could feel it the moment we came in." Any one of those dresses could cost hundreds of pounds, said Polly. But Diggory was more interested in the faces, and indeed these were well worth looking at. The people sat in their stone chairs on each side of the room, and in the floor, in each side of the room, and the floor was left free down the middle. You could walk down and turn and look at the faces in turn. "They were nice people, I think," said Diggory. Polly nodded. All the faces they could see were certainly nice. Both the men and women looked kind and wise, and they seemed to come of a handsome race. But after the children had gone a few steps down the room, they came to faces that looked a little different. These were very solemn faces. You felt you have to mind your P's and Q's if you ever met living people who looked like that. When they had gone a little further, they found themselves among faces they didn't like. This was about in the middle of the room. The faces here looked very strong and proud and happy, but they looked cruel. A little further on, they looked crueler. Further on again, they were still cruel, but they no longer looked happy. There were even despairing faces, as if the people they belonged to had done dreadful things and also suffered dreadful things. The last figure of all was the most interesting. A woman even more richly dressed than the others, very tall, but every figure in the room was taller than the people of our world, with a look of such fierceness and pride that it took your breath away. Yet she was beautiful, too. Years afterwards, when he was an old man, Diggory said he had never in all his life known a woman so beautiful. It is only fair to add that Polly also said she couldn't see anything specially beautiful about her. This woman, as I said, was the last, but there were plenty of empty chairs beyond her, as if the room had been intended for a much larger collection of images. "I do wish we knew the story that's behind all this," said Diggory. "Let's go back and look at that table sort of thing in the middle of the room." The thing in the middle of the room was not exactly a table. It was a square pillar about 4 feet high, and on it there rose a little golden arch, from which there hung a little golden bell, and beside this there lay a little golden hammer to hit the bell with. I wonder," said Diggory. "There seems to be something written here," said Polly, stooping down and looking at the side of the pillar. "By gum, so there is," said Diggory, "but of course we shan't be able to read it." Shan't we? I'm not so sure, said Polly. They both looked at it hard, and as you might have expected, the letters cut in the stone were strange. But now a great wonder happened, for, as they looked, though the shape of the strange letters never altered, they found that they could understand them. If only Diggory had remembered what he himself had said a few minutes ago, that this was an enchanted room, he might have guessed that the enchantment was beginning to work. But he was too wild with curiosity to think about that. He was longing more and more to know what was written on the pillar, and very soon they both knew what it said was something like this. At least this is the sense of it, though the poetry when you read it there was better. Make your choice, adventurous stranger. Strike the bell and bide the danger, or wonder till it drives you mad what would have followed if you had. It's that. That's the poem. Buster. It's my dog. Sorry. Let me just... Alright, I'm going to read the poem one more time, and then I'll read the rest of the pages. Make your choice, adventurous stranger. Strike the bell and bide the danger, or wonder till it drives you mad what would have followed if you had. No fear, said Polly. We don't want any danger. Oh, but don't you see it's no good, said Diggory. We can't get out of it now. We shall always be wondering what else would have happened if we had struck the bell. I'm not going home to be driven mad by always thinking of that. No fear. Don't be silly, said Polly, as if anyone would. What does it matter what would have happened? I expect anyone who's come as far as this bound to go on wondering till it sends them dotty. That's the magic of it, you see. I can feel it beginning to work on me already. Well, I don't, said Polly crossly. I don't believe you do either. You're just putting it on. That's all you know, said Diggory. It's because you're a girl. Girls never want to know anything but gossip and rot about people getting engaged. You looked exactly like your uncle when you said that, said Polly. Why can't you keep to the point, said Diggory. What we're talking about is... How exactly like a man, said Polly in a very, very grown-up voice, but she added hastily in her real voice, and don't say I'm just like a woman, or you'll be a beastly copycat. I should never dream of calling a kid like you a woman, said Diggory loftily. Oh, I'm a kid, am I? Said Polly, who was now in a real rage. Well, you needn't be bothered by having a kid with you any longer then. I'm off. I've had enough of this place, and I've had enough of you too, you beastly stuck-up obstinate pig. None of that, said Diggory in a voice even nastier than he meant it to be, for he saw Polly's hand moving to her pocket to get a hold of her yellow ring. I can't excuse what he did next by saying that he was very sorry for it afterwards, and so were a good many other people. Before Polly's hand reached her pocket, he grabbed her wrist, leaning across with his back against her chest. Then, keeping her other arm out of the way with his other elbow, he leaned forward, picked up the hammer, and struck the golden bell a light, smart tap. Then he let her go, and they fell apart, staring at each other and breathing hard. Polly was just beginning to cry, not with fear and not even because he had hurt her wrist quite badly, but with furious anger. Within 2 seconds, however, they had something to think about that drove their own quarrels quite out of their minds. As soon as the bell was struck, it gave out a note, a sweet note, such as you might have expected, and not very loud. But instead of dying away again, it went on, and as it went on, it grew louder. Before a minute had passed, it was twice as loud as it. There's so much words. Before a minute had passed, it was twice as loud as it had been to begin with. It was soon so loud that if the children had tried to speak, but they weren't thinking of speaking now, they were just standing there with their mouths open, they would not have heard one another. Very soon it was so loud that they could not have heard one another even by shouting, and still it grew, all on one note, a continuous sweet sound, though the sweetness had something horrible about it, till all the air in that great room was throbbing with it, and they could feel the stone floor trembling under their feet. Then at last it began to be mixed with another sound, a vague, disastrous noise which sounded first like a roar of a distant train, and then like the crash of a falling tree. They heard something like great weights falling. Finally, with a sudden rush and thunder and a shake that nearly flung them off their feet, about a quarter of the roof at the end of the room fell in. Great blocks of masonry fell all around them, and the walls rocked. The noise of the bell stopped. The clouds and dust cleared away. Everything became quiet again. It was never found out whether the fall of the roof was due to magic, or whether that unbearably loud sound from the bell just happened to strike the note, which was more than those crumbling walls could stand. "There, I hope you're satisfied now," panted Polly. "Well, it's all over anyway," said Diggory, and both thought it was, but they had never been more mistaken in their lives. All right, so the next chapter we're going to be reading is going to be chapter 5, Deplorable World. It's the art. But for right now, that's all I got. So, I love you, Mom. I will see you tomorrow or whenever you watch this. Goodbye.